Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It is time to take some viewer questions, and we start this week with Martin on the Patreon, who asks, what is the procedure for royal recommendations on private members' bills? Why did it take a point of order question at third reading for it to be determined on C-265 the other day? And why does it even require a point of order? Surely this is something that should be vetted, possibly by the Speaker's office at the outset. Okay, so there's a bit of a history with this in terms of both how royal recommendations have worked traditionally and also changes they made around private members' business. So first of all, background, a royal recommendation is basically what authorizes a government to spend money. And it comes from the Governor General, and it's basically saying, yes, the government can spend money to do whatever is in this piece of legislation. Generally, private members' bills, which are from backbenchers and opposition MPs, so anyone not in cabinet, they cannot spend money because they are not members of the government. And therefore, any of their bills, which are private members' bills, would need a royal recommendation if it was to spend money. Similarly, in the Senate, they can't have money bills there because that is a constitutional issue. And similar kind of concept. So what happens with private members' bills is you get from time to time MPs who come up with a bill that would require the spending of money. And sometimes they try to get really cute about it and try to make kinds of excuses why, no, this really doesn't mean spending money, but most of the time it does. And for that bill to be valid, it would require a royal recommendation. So a couple of changes that happened. There was one in 94 that changed procedures around how royal recommendations happened. And that had to do with, before that, the recommendation had to come to Parliament separately before the bill was introduced. And then they managed to create a system where on a government piece of legislation, it would have a certain preamble that would essentially be the royal recommendation, or at least give them the opportunity to have one later. In 2003, the House of Commons adopted some changes to their standing orders that let more private members' bills come to the floor. Previously, it used to be more difficult for them. They moved to this new system where basically anyone can move a private member's bill, and they would simply allocate time for them every day, and the order would be determined by lottery, and so on and so on. So it really opened up the ability to put these kind of bills on the order paper and have them come up for debate. And one of the things they did was changed the standing orders so that it wouldn't need a royal recommendation at the time it came to the House, only before the final hour of third reading, before it would go to a vote. And it did it, the logic behind it, if you look through the procedure and practice manual, is both, one, it affords the bill debate regardless, two, it allows them to make changes to under the somewhat assumption that this recommendation for a royal, or the need for a royal recommendation is mistaken, so it allows them to change it so it wouldn't require it. But it also kind of gives them the faint hope that, they can convince the government to give them said royal recommendation before it gets to that point. And so it kind of gives them, just I guess we'll call it faint hope. So that's kind of how it happened. I'm not sure why in this particular bill it was a point of order. It could have been that it wasn't clear, and it required the Speaker to make a ruling on it. or it was just that there hadn't been enough awareness that this was required, and this was kind of their way of flagging attention to it. I'm not really sure why exactly. Yeah, they needed the speaker to have a point of order, but that should have been more automatic. I do think it's a problem that we allow bills to basically get to that point without having the royal recommendation, because you're on the one hand setting up false hope, and on the other hand you are spending parliamentary time debating a lost cause, and I think that is not really great for MPs when they could be spending their time on a bill that has a chance of actually getting passed and not just stalling at third reading stage. And more recently, we saw the NDP try and be cute about this as well with their pharmacare bill, knowing that this was something that would obviously require a royal recommendation, but they wanted to at least get it to a stage in debate where they could, put on a big song and dance about it and try and embarrass the government into saying that they didn't really care about pharmacare and so on, knowing that it was a doomed bill anyway because they were never going to get that royal recommendation. So that's kind of one of the side effects of that. We have a second question from Martin, who says, you have long complained that question period has degenerated into little more than an opportunity for members or parties to gather clips for their social media. Why is it allowed when taking pictures in the House is not allowed? Twofold here. One, pictures in the House are allowed from 2 accredited photojournalists on any given day. So it's not that they're not allowed at all. It's just that members are not allowed to take them, or anyone in the galleries, or journalists who are not those 2 accredited photojournalists are allowed. And that's I guess they're kind of relief valve, but I mean, it's the photojournalists serve an important purpose, and they're not using it to basically betray any confidences or anything like that. I think that is part of why there's this notion about photographs in the chamber. Is part of it is just kind of the I'm trying to think of the right word here. It's not really privacy, the debate, but we have to remember that there was a time when in early parliaments that they didn't allow people with notepaper or notepads and pens in the galleries because they could be spies for the king. So there's this kind of history around this certain amount of I don't want to say secrecy, but allowing the debates to be held without fear that they're being used for nefarious purposes, or that what they're saying is going to get back to, Charles I or anything like that. So that's kind of the historical logic around it. It has to do, again, it's tied in with parliamentary privileges, the same way that they are basically allowed to say anything in the chamber and not face censure or lawsuit, because it's about freedom of expression and being able to say what needs to be said, regardless. And that's kind of the history behind it. The thing with clips is, ever since the advent of broadcast, it has become an issue in terms of media outlets would choose clips for the evening news out of question period, and it soon became less about an ongoing debate on issues than parties trying to find ways of getting their clips onto the evening news. And so that it became, as someone I know termed it, less of a feast and more of a buffet. So you don't have a continuous meal. You've got different little things here and there that media can then clip from, and that's also why you will notice that parties or leaders in particular will ask the same question in English as they will in French, because they want the availability of that clip for media in both languages. And it's distracting when you're watching it live, and it interrupts the flow of debate. And I get the logic behind it, but it's irritating nevertheless. So with that, the gathering clips for social media has just kind of exacerbated that same phenomenon. So it's using question period, knowing that it's going to be broadcast, and using that knowledge in order to be able to take clips for your own purposes rather than for the media's purposes. And that's kind of where that distinction changed. And I think personally think it's had a very corrosive effect on what actually happens in there, because now we're seeing instances where you're just getting 12 variations of the same question asked by 12 different MPs, so that each of them can post on their own social media that particular clip. We had a meltdown a few weeks ago with the hybrid parliament, because one MP's camera stopped working. We could hear the question he was asking, and he got a response from the government, but he had an absolute meltdown demanding to be able to ask his question ever again with the camera on, because we know that this was about gathering a clip for his social media. And when the speaker said, no, you got to ask your question, we could all hear it. And he insisted that no, he needed to be able to have it with the video and so on. And so it's become a giant issue in this current hybrid setting and so on. That if there's a technical interruption, we will start over right at the again with asking the question again before we get to the answer, so that they can have one continuous clip rather than an edit. And it drives me to absolute distraction. But that is unfortunately where we are, and unless we tighten up things like the copyright around broadcast proceedings, then that kind of leaves us to where we are. So that's kind of the unfortunate side of that one. Our next question is on Twitter from Chun She U, who asks, at what point can a governor general or lieutenant governor step in to dismiss the prime minister or premier like Australia did in the 1970s? That is a particularly almost unique situation. What happened there was the House of Commons and the Senate, which is elected in Australia, were basically at loggerheads over a supply bill, which means the ability for government to spend money to run its operations. And things were so desperate at that time that the Prime Minister was phoning up commercial banks and basically seeing if they could loan the government money up until the point where they could pass a supply bill and allow government operations to continue and salaries to be paid and so on. And it was this impasse that there was very little way for them to break the impasse. And that was basically when the Governor General decided he was going to dismiss the Prime Minister and allow for a double dissolution, so that both chambers would go to elections, and kind of in the hopes that they could resolve the impasse and get supply moving again. So that's basically what happened in that situation. It was a very unique set of circumstances. That is almost it would be difficult to find a rationale that's similar for a kind of dismissal like what happened in that particular situation. Really, it was a crisis of a real constitutional crisis of a real magnitude in Australia. And even to this day, there is a lot of academic inquiry over it. We just had a whole exercise about getting the correspondence that the Governor General had with Buckingham Palace to see whether the Queen herself was directly involved in this. And as it turns out, she was not. It was kind of like dealing with her private secretary in order to ensure that there was a line of separation or a bulwark between the prime minister and the queen, to keep her hands out of it. But yeah, that was a very unique set of circumstances, and it's going to be almost impossible to find a similar situation that would justify that kind of a dismissal. Our final question is also from Twitter, from Gon Fallon, who asks, why does the Supreme Court Justice, and I'm guessing he means Chief Justice, replace the Governor General when she's forced out, and when are we going to fix this? The forced out thing is very much up for debate. I don't know that it was necessarily forced out, as she realized she had very few options available to her once that workplace report came out. As for why it's the Chief Justice, this goes to the letters patent from 1947, whereby the king at the time had kind of outlined the roles and responsibilities for the Governor General of Canada in very specific language. And one of those, one of the pieces in that letters patent was an ability for, if the Governor General is incapacitated or dies in office or something to that effect, that we have an ability for someone to take over as an administrator, and they determined it was going to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And I think that was partially in terms of just having a somewhat neutral figure who could do it. And the Chief Justice acts as a deputy to the Governor General in many respects anyway, in terms of being able to give bills royal assent, or sign orders in council or so on if the Governor General is out of town or indisposed. Why it matters is because if we don't have a Governor General in place, government grinds to a halt. There's very little that the Prime Minister can do without needing the signature of the Governor General, whether it's royal assent on bills, whether it's granting supply, royal recommendations, as we discussed earlier, orders in council, anything like that that requires the Governor General to sign off. And if there was a situation where the Governor General was incapacitated or died in office, we couldn't do the government would entirely be paralyzed until we could get around that. So there was a provision for an administrator. The drafting of similar rules around it for provinces didn't quite have the same level of specificity. And it became an issue when a lieutenant governor died in office and realized that the administrator in that province could not act in the absence of there being a lieutenant governor in office. And then we repeated that 2 summers ago when we had 2 LGs die in office in the same summer, which was just a very strange confluence of events, but that's what happened. So that is basically why that happens. In terms of how do we fix it, I'm not sure that it's something that needs to be fixed. I understand the issue in terms of optics, that you do not want the Chief Justice to be acting in the administrator capacity for very long. And I understand some of the reluctance in terms of if he's signing bills into law for royal assent, and then those bills come before the court, is he in some kind of a conflict of interest? I would say not really. Because the level of discretion for a Governor General is very, very minute. They act on advice of the government that has the confidence of the chamber. So they really can't refuse bills if they're brought before them for royal assent. The circumstances for which would have to be extraordinary for that to happen, and that's really not something I think normally a Chief Justice would have to worry about in an administrator capacity. There's no real conflict there because there is no real discretion being being exercised. Similar with, a request for prorogation or dissolution for an election. Again, because we operate on the principle of confidence, the Governor General will generally accept that advice. There was some academic debate around prorogation with the 2008 crisis, but there really was very little room for her to have discretion on that issue. And I generally think the right call was essentially made there, and it kind of later was brought clear when that coalition attempt fell apart over the prorogation period. So the right call was essentially made, but the degree of discretion around there is very, very limited. So it's not really going to be an issue for the Chief Justice. But it is kind of annoying, and we would like a permanent Governor General in there as soon as possible. And we know that there is a process ongoing. Who knows how long that's going to take with this particular government in these current pandemic times, but that's kind of where it's at. And hopefully that answers your question. And that is everything for this week. Thanks once again for all of your questions. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.